All right, so hello and welcome everybody to NR4CS 2026 second session today. We'll be talking about the better data quality in citizen science and going beyond data accuracy. Before we dive in, a little bit of housekeeping tips. So the meeting is being recorded and the presentations and the meeting recording will be shared with everybody later. If you feel comfortable to do so, please keep your cameras on to enhance the interaction and engagement of this session. So today we have two speakers with us. We've got a new NR4CS member, welcome Anupoma, who will be talking about her lived experiences in rare diseases, and then we'll have a guest presentation by Professor Jaume Piera. And then we'll have the discussions, Q&A, and then we'll also be talking a little bit about the next meeting that we'll have in July. So Dr. Anupoma Pinki Haque will be talking about the rare patients as partners working with invisible data. Anupoma has been actively involved in citizen science and community advocacy from an early age and has been driven by questions around why equitable access to healthcare, standard care, and disaster relief is not available to everyone as it should be. This passion led her to become a care professional, public health and technology expert, a science communicator, and also a data policy influencer with experiences across the globe from Bangladesh to Netherlands and Austria. So for the past 26 years, she's been working at the intersection of health, technology, policy, creating meaningful connections through citizen science initiatives, cost actions, and European projects. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to give the floor to you, Anupama.
Hello, everyone. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Allow me to share my screen. Can everyone see my presentation?
Yes,
can hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, so I start with the most important question, yes, why citizen science? Maybe you all have the answer, but from my perspective, I think because we are not independent, we are all interdependent with each other. And the logo you see on this slide is one of the cost actions that I am vice chairing, which is called Beacon. And it looks at the interconnection of plant health, human health, and the environment and animal health, how we are all interconnected and how we should be all aware of that. I think the same principle runs for citizen science. Because we are interconnected, we should be working with each other as well. These are a few of the organization and cost actions that I am involved with. As you can see, apart from One Health, there is another cost action that I work with, which is Better Care, which is looking at informal care setting of elderly care and chronic patient care at home. So not in a structured formal setting. Another one is looking at chronic care at home, but not the elderly, but across the ages. So from children to elderly, all kind of patients that are taken care of at home, which is called Better Care. So programming Better Care, and hopefully hoping to influence policy, which is called SIDNET. So I titled my presentation, very short one, Rare Patients as Partners Working with Invisible Data. Now, why I use the word partners is that specifically for rare patients, we are most often looked at as consumers of care and services, but not as partners with whom you can co-create, co-design research, clinical trial, or intervention. And our focus with all the organizations and actions that I'm involved with, our focus is to co-create human-centered solutions involving all stakeholders across the chain of care. And the word invisible, does anyone notice anything?
Yes, the GIVLE.
Yes. If you think I made a spelling mistake, no, it's not a spelling mistake. I intentionally use this spelling, not a SI, because we are often invisible and we are often not vigilant. So I'm going to explain a little bit in the next slides, but yeah. So I'm also a tea specialist if you're interested. I know how to make 200 different type of tea. Um, so visibility and vigilance, as I was saying, that having a rare disease sometimes create a situation where you feel invisible. So your rare disease sign symptoms, if it is not so visible with your physical representation or in your behavior, in your movement, you become an invisible person to or a normal or not necessary to take any action kind of situation to the care, to the system, to the policy. And vigilance, as the word suggests, being alert to typically detect danger, risk, opportunities. Unfortunately, it is not happening at the system level for rare diseases. And what it means is that uh, around 36 million people who live in EU with a rare disease, they are often not detected through the system and policy and not taken care of. And with 6,000 to 8,000, actually recent data says the type of different rare diseases can go up to 12,000, 80% of which is genetic, and they are often chronic, progressive, degenerative, and life-threatening. And the impact of patient involves that it can show up as soon as you're born, so in newborns, and it can cause lifelong disabling conditions. So obviously, actions needs to be taken. Two distinct information we should keep in our mind is that out of these 36 million people, half of them are undiagnosed. And even if you get a diagnosis and correct diagnosis, usually the time from presentation to diagnosis is 5 years. That is very long. And remember, within those 5 years, you are still progressively, degeneratively going into life-threatening situation. Even if you're alive, you're in and out of hospitals all the time. Apart from the rare disease community, there's another chunk of population that is increasing at the beginning of 2025, the elderly population, so people who are over 65 years needing constant care, it was around 20%, but by 2030, 2050, it will increase to 30% and even more. What is worrying is that all these people who needs daily care, 80% of long-term care is happening in an informal setting by untrained people. So the problem here is that if medical error is happening, if harm is happening, if mistakes are made and more and more hospitalized are happening, we just don't have data. Our assumption is that if medical errors can happen in hospitals, in care homes where the structure is formal and care is trained, then what is happening in the informal situation? We just don't have any data. So basically what we need is good quality, regular, system level data for decision making, for management processes, and the system to perform better. But what does good data actually mean? Now, if we look at different data quality dimensions, we talk about accuracy, we talk about completeness of the data, consistency of data, timeliness, validity, and so on and so forth. But according to the context, especially for the rare disease community, these dimensions may mean something very different from the traditional data. For example, accuracy. Even with the same diagnosis, if the clinical representation for each patient is different, then what do you say about the data? Nothing will match. But it is what you're observing or you're measuring, even in a hospital. Completeness. This is a double-sided sword here. Completeness, yes, you want complete data for better analysis and better decision making. But incompleteness, for our context, basically or so often mean the patient is dead. Yes, we die very fast and quite often. So do we then take that incomplete data and not use it? No, we do use it as much as possible to prevent the next death. Consistency, again, just like accuracy, according to the context, according to the diagnosis, according to the type of rare disease you have, data can be very inconsistent, but still usable. I will not go into so much details about this dimension of data because Jaume will explain in much more details. So I will just move on to how you can get processes, especially for rare conditions. Here are some of the initiatives that is present in the EU. There are different projects, different actions like Share for Rare, Quality of Life Person Living with Vascular Liver Disease. AirDera is a big part for research and funding and across EU initiatives and so on. ERNs are a range of hospitals who deal with patients put anything up because I believe for if you want to get involved with the elderly care and geriatric medicine or geriatric care, it is best to get involved with your local organizers or local partners. So there were a lot of questions written for this presentation. I expect most of the questions, or maybe all of them, are for Jaume, but from the patients and families' perspective, I try to answer a few of them. For example, what are the best practices of providing feedback? Is it collective meeting, provide a manual? I would say whenever it is possible and the opportunity is there, please talk to the citizen scientists face to face, have a discussion, have a question answer session. That works the best. If it is not possible, then you can think about other ways. How should researchers deal with incomplete or inconsistent data? I think I answered it. Yeah. If you're dead, even if you're dead, your data is useful. How accurate data can inform policy? This is a very important question, I find, and I will answer this with a question. When you go to the table to talk to the policy, do you think accuracy is policy what is looking for, or is it the first priority on their agenda? It might not be. So think about carefully and think which dimension of data would be actually most attractive to policy. How to handle data from different sources which is contradicting each other. Another very important question, and we face it on a daily basis. Like I said, even with the same diagnosis, you can observe very contradicting data, very contradicting signs, symptoms, clinical representation of the same diagnosis. What do? You having one set of data contradicting another set of data does not mean one set is false or wrong. I would say in this kind of situation, look at the methodology and describe as in many details as you can how the data was collected. and be transparent about sharing, and let the observer or the citizen, the audience decide uh, how they feel about this contradicting data. So be transparent, be open. Accessibility of data relationship with open science. I personally and strongly believe data should be accessible, free, and access should be universal. What kind of quality parameters should be checked? It completely depends on the context, and ask start with the question why. Why are you collecting this data in the first place? And that would determine what dimension of the data and parameters should be checked to make it a good quality data. How we can unify data collection between countries. Well, you can collaborate and maybe use the same system, same methodology for collecting data, but data control, storage, and access, I do not believe it should be unified. It runs the risk of getting breached or destroyed for some reason. Then if one part is destroyed, it can have a chain reaction to the rest of the data set. So storage should be separate, I think. Impact of using AI for data management. This we are facing now, that everyone is interested to use AI. And I'm a big activist of using data, collecting data, using data ethically, equitably, and fairly, safely. So I would say, if your AI is good, effective, keep it to the administrative part of data management. So collecting, put them in right places, flagging missing data, or maybe analyze and send red flags. Yes, okay. But when it comes to making a decision of patients, intervention for patients, then the decision making should still be within patient family, and the care team, not on AI. I would like to learn more about how citizen science projects can ensure data reliability when involving non-professional contributors. I think I have seen similar questions. 2, 3 questions deal with this when non-professionals are collecting data and trained scientists are looking at data. How do you? I think, and this would be the last question I try to answer. I believe when you ask an important question and when you try to answer that question with logical, step-by-step, systematic framework, you are doing science. It doesn't have to come with a scientist certificate to do science. We were all doing science even before we became scientists, yeah? So it's the process, the methodology that you are following to collect and manage your data. So if you are following a very well-designed methodology, then I don't think your background will matter, and the quality of data should be good. And handling bias and uncertainty, they are always there. Sometimes you can take some very specific steps to avoid bias and uncertainty, but in real life, in real situations, especially for rare disease community, elderly community, the situation we face every day, there is always maybe some kind of uncertainty and bias. The best possible thing is to create trust, and the best possible way to create trust, we have only 2 ways: um, being consistent and being transparent. And as I mentioned before, consistency is something that you may or may not be able to achieve all the time, but transparency is always possible. So describe your methodology of collecting data. It doesn't have to match. You may always not agree with each other, but if it is published openly, honestly, in details, you can always be transparent and let the audience decide. So this is what that's the last slide. Thank you for listening. Thank you for participating. Thank you for responsibility. Citizen science is sometimes the only way we can deal with rare disease patients. So thank you for that. And if you'd like to, please ask away.
Thank you so much, Anupama. And I know this topic is very close to your heart. Thank you for sharing that with us. It's interesting when we think about the unfairness of how the burden of spreading awareness about these things often falls on the patients and the patient families. And I'm so glad that you're here today sharing that responsibility with us and telling us how we can all contribute to the topic. So thank you. We have a couple of minutes for questions. If anybody wants to ask questions to Anupama, there would also be an opportunity to ask in the end. We can have a combined discussion as well. But if you have any burning questions, yes, Santi, Iago, over to you.
Yes, hello. Thanks a lot. That was a fascinating presentation and even more fascinating topic, specifically for rare diseases. My question would be, when it happens that there are rare diseases undiagnosed and the whole thing, then people may go into the black holes of Reddit and endless Google searches and AI, ChatGPT stuff, all these things happening. What is your take on, are those things useful to collect data? Because a lot of people, they share very personal data on what they do with those communities and uh, uh, tools. Um, is there anything that, how do you consider that kind of sharing within citizen science framework? I don't know how to put this, but like I see that a lot of people do that, and that might be useful, but that might not be useful. So, what is your take on that?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for asking this question because it brings us to a reality which is in stark contrast with any other kind of patients. So, we always talk about data privacy, data security, confidentiality, and all that. So, the goal is to keep data as private as possible. Whereas in case of rare disease patients, you feel so alone and, you know, out of the range of the normal reality. And you were desperately trying to find a second person who is exactly like you. So the goal is completely opposite. You want your data to go out there and find someone who is exactly like you so you can maybe try to find a solution. For example, we have a condition called ROAD, and knowingly the global number is 25. And because of complication, we are losing patient very often. So um, when you ask, is it useful? I would say rare disease patients will do anything and everything to find a second person who is just exactly like him or her. So, any kind of communication, any kind of platform which can achieve that goal will be used. Is it useful to find patient? Yes. Is it safe, or other things that we usually think about when we are sharing data online? That is a debatable question because we take calculated risk all the time, right? And sometimes when you are trying to live or trying to understand what is happening to you, um, the risk you are willing to take is very different from somebody like you and me. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, just sorry, because I know there is a hand raised there. It's just like the question is like, is that science? Can we consider that as science? We know it's citizen, it's engaging, it's community, but is it science? Do you consider that as science?
Okay, so it's very context driven. So what you are doing, what you are exactly doing among all these activities, that is the question. So are you collecting data? And is that data collected in a logical, systematic, step-by-step methodology? Yeah. Then, if you're following the scientific process to collect data, and there are standards, many standards, yeah, then I would say yes, it is science. What did we do before we started doing physical experiments or the hallmark of what we call science, usual science? We were observing, we were sharing whatever we were experiencing. And recently, European Union also formally recognized patient experience data. So if you are sharing and working with patient experience data, I would say it is science.
Thank you, Anupama. In the interest of time, Maya, very quickly, your question. Go for it.
Yeah, actually, it was just a comment because, as you know, I can talk for 2 hours on these topics. So I do agree. First, this is science, even if you just draw the research agenda together with the patients. What's more science than that? And we never ask the patients what they really would like us researchers to research on. So that's change the paradigm. So that's first. And I would just like to comment to answer to the question, why citizen science? And actually for me, in working in rare diseases as well, actually at least creating a community for them and giving them the possibility to share. They really would like to have the possibility to talk and show their experience. When you give them the possibility to talk, they will talk for hours, and you see how much they are in need of these, because maybe doctors don't listen so much, so we need to create these occasions for really democracy, for a better research, a research that also think about the commercial uptake of a drug that is developed together with the patient, because it's really fulfilling the request. Okay, so stop.
Thank you, Maya. And that reminds me that something that academics or researchers or even doctors cannot do. So between hospital visits, at the hospital, you're collecting data and you're following all the process and systems and gold standard and everything. Yeah. But in case of rare diseases, when you don't know what is happening to the patient or you don't even have the diagnosis, what helps is between those two hospital visits, everything that is happening with the patient, which is collected by maybe the partner or the family, that is valuable data. Sometimes that is where you find your answer. So, yes, it is science and it is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for this invigorating discussion, and we can carry this on at the end after Jaume's talk as well. So over to our next speaker. We'll be hearing more about better data quality in citizen science, going beyond data accuracy. So this really nicely follows Anupoma's talk by Professor Jaume Piera. Jaume is the head of the MBMOS research group at the Institute of Marine Sciences in Barcelona, and has been actively involved with EXA, which is the European Citizen Science Association, since its early years, including service on its board of directors until 2023. His research mainly focuses on citizen science data, including governance, engagement strategies, DIY sensing technologies, and data quality. He's currently coordinates several European projects, including NERIS, the ProBlue, and is involved in the upcoming Enforce project focused on environmental protection and citizen participation. So with that, I'll stop sharing and over to you, Jaume.
Okay, thank you very much, Pooja. And okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. If you could,
Okay.
yeah, perfect.
Perfect. Yeah, and also I would like to thank Anupoma, the first part of the talk, because I think it's very complementary. She addressed mainly this from the health research or health issues, and I will try to complement with other type of views. As you will see, I have split the talk in 2 parts. The first part will be a little bit more conceptual, and we will address ideas how we can go from data, extracting information and knowledge, and finally get some wisdom and on any process we study. We will, to understand this framework, we will review a little bit some previous data collections and how this data end up to the full understanding of the phenomena we were studying in that case. And then we will go on the, I would say, core topic of this talk about how data need to be addressed in other disciplines and in general, and particularly with this idea of multidimensional approach that previously Anupoma was mentioning. And then we will take some home messages about data quality, and then we will go to the second part. The second part will be much more practical. We will try to address which is the role of citizen science in this idea on this framework of multidimensional data quality. And then we will review this in two practical cases. One is how to address this multi-dimensional quality when we monitor large-scale biodiversity, in particular in the example in coastal areas, but it could be explained or addressed in any other type. And the other will be one addressing water quality and what is called essential ocean variables with these do-it-yourself instruments. So let's go for this conceptual framework. You will see that we always address this idea that, okay, we start with data, and then we try to retrieve from that data some information. And in this information usually identify some patterns, trends, we identify what could be, the context of what we are studying. From this pattern identification, we usually try to get knowledge. And in some cases, this is because we formulate theories on concepts around these patterns, try to explain why we have identified those patterns. And finally, in the top of that is whenever we understand fully the system. In this particular case, in many cases, from practical cases, is when we can make decisions fully, supported by what sometimes is called evidence-based decisions or evidence-based policies. So there is these two components, if you want, one very academic, fully understanding what we are studying, and the other is how we take decisions whenever these studies or processes we are studying has some consequences or require some management, or in the case, for example, healthcare, taking decisions about patients or things like that. So let's also focus the particular, I would say, bottom layers. We get some data, and with this data, it could be qualified. And we can ask how this data quality may affect the correct identification of patterns and trends, because this, it's a cascading effect. If we are not identifying correctly the patterns or the identifying, maybe then we can go with incorrect or biased, or I don't know how to call it, but wrong hypotheses, wrong experiments, and obviously we end up with completely incorrect wisdom or understanding of the phenomena. So it's very important from the very beginning to understand which are the consequences of this data quality, and mention this kind of multidimensional. Should we address accuracy, but also the extension? We will see the frequency of the data we obtain, how these elements, how these choices may affect, the patterns we retrieve. So let's start from the very beginning. At the very beginning, probably one of the first patterns we identify, the humanity, was the movement of the sun. And I give here, you can see on my right, if we stay in a particular place all the time, the whole year, we will see that the sunset change through the year. So you can see at the beginning on our left, in winter, we identify the sunset, the position of the sun or the sunset in one particular place, then it's shifted, and then going back to the winter. This probably was one of the first patterns that the humanity identified. And you can see, for example, I put two very ancient, I would say, observatories. The first one is in Vordiyuang. It's close to Melbourne. And you can see that probably 11,000 years ago, those communities, had already identified what is where the midsummer sunset was located, and also when the winter sunset was different. And they put some rocks, and it was very important, probably, to identify seasonalities, that it was at that particular communities, probably they indicate the seasons where to collect fruits or where to hunt particular animals. Stone Age is probably a little bit more well known because it's closer in Europe, but also you can see that probably, I don't know, 5,000, 4,000 years ago, they perfectly identify all these, I would say, elements, astronomical elements. Going a little bit further, people also started observing not only the sun, but also the stars and the planets. And I will mention particularly the position of Mars. You can see at the top, and there is the Egyptian names that were when they refer to Mars. One of the first names was Haque. Haque was the red one because you know the planet is a little bit reddish. But the second one, which is difficult to pronounce, Sekdet F M Ketket, they say the ones that travels backwards, because if you follow the position of Mars in the sky several days or several nights, you will see that sometimes there is this retrograde, as I can show here in the picture, and this was obviously a little bit strange for them, how a movement in the sky could go backwards and then again forward. And then during the history, there were several people trying to explain this type of movement. The first was Ptolemy. Ptolemy, as you know, he had this geocentric view. He assumed that all the bodies were moving around the Earth, and he tried to explain that some of these bodies has this movement that allows to identify these retrograde in positions. But also Nicholas Copernicus was changing completely the view of astronomy, and he said that it could be also explainable that particular movement if we consider different positions of the Earth and Mars moving around the sun. Then how people collected data about astronomy? Well, one of the instruments that was frequently used at that time, it was the world quadrant. With this, it's a kind of, if you say tube, and in this tube you move and you locate, the angles in which the positions of the planets or the stars could be located. And in particular, I would like to mention this, the one that was built by Tycho Brahe. At that time, it was, by the end of the 16th century, was considered the most accurate world quadrant. As you can see, more or less in the picture, there were several people, the observer, the one that moves the angle, but also there was one timekeeper, and he used two clocks to record the time, and also the recorder. So imagine a lot of people involved on that positions, but it was very important. The motivation of Tycho was, we know that it was wrong, but he had this idea of theory that, as you can see, I don't know, can you see my pointer? No, right? Well, anyway, you can see that.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Then there is for him, the sun was moving around the Earth, and several planets were moving around the sun. So it was a kind of mixture between geocentric and heliocentric view. But in any case, we know that now it's wrong, but he was motivated, and he thought at that time that thanks to that data, he would be able to validate that particular hypothesis. Here you can see all in yellow orange, all the records that Tycho made during these nearly 20 years of observations. And you can see in this, I would say, light blue lines are the ones that are reconstructed from NASA. So, and you can see the matching. He was really good. So he really provided very, very accurate data, but not only accurate data, you can see the amount of values he recorded over the 20 years. And this is very important because now we can see that it's a particular situation in which we have very great data, but at the same time, a lot of data. And this gives us this, what we call it, data density. So imagine that on average, he recorded nearly more than 100 values for each orbit of Mars. So here we have two dimensions: accuracy, high accurate values, but also completeness, if you want, in terms of high data density. A lot of measurements in every single orbit. And this was particularly important because you can see that when now we know that the orbits are elliptic, but at that time nobody knew that. But when you collect data, in some cases, as you can see in red, the values are very similar in both cases. In some cases, you may have some blue, in which starting departing a bit from the circular, and only, I would say, extreme values in which are very different in brackets, because as you will see, the ellipses are not so big. So it was quite critical to get those particular values to understand that the orbit was elliptic. The person who studied more that Tycho's Brahe data was Kepler. Kepler was having its own view. He was, a very religious man, and he thought that the God, the creator, should be a perfect perfect in terms of geometry, and he thought that all the orbits should be, included in perfect regular geometric bodies. But when he started analyzing Tycho's data, he, for example, discarded completely, very easy, the ideas of Tycho, but also he realized that it was nothing related to these ideas of geometric bodies within this geometric schema. But he started thinking that at least it should be orbital circular orbits around the sun. But thanks to the Tycho's data, he found some of these values. It were, if we think on the orbit prediction, in some cases, it was a little bit big difference. And because Tycho's instrument was so accurate, the uncertainty in those cases was very little. And this was more or less in comparison the uncertainty from the classical other type of instruments. So he realized that even in some cases, or even in a small proportion of cases, the circular orbit was not good enough. And he knew that Tycho's accuracy was too high, to admit such a kind of error. And you can see here when he mentioned, because, well, he wrote this book. It is a kind of reference for modern astronomy. Kepler is considered somehow the father of the modern astronomy. And you can see that he mentioned particularly the name of Tycho's because he considered that, in fact, this error or this difference was the thing that changed everything. So he spent like 3 years considering circular orbits, but when he identified such a kind of difference, he decided that something was wrong on his model. Rather than to think, well, only a few cases, my model does not fit with Tycho's data. But he knew that Tycho's data was so good that he changed completely the model, despite, he was spent during 3 years making their own calculus by hand. And he decided to spend 2 years more on changing completely. And he mentioned this, that he said that let us down pass to the reform to all astronomy. And with this, he reframed everything. He put this idea of elliptic orbits, and he created what is well known now as the Kepler laws. I will not go in detail, but all these laws are with this idea that we have these elliptic orbits, and that the sun is one on those focus. Nearly 80 years later, there was another brilliant scientist that take all this information and try to explain why it happened, these elliptics, why they move in this way, why planets move and follow a Kepler's law. Yeah, it was Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton, 80 years later, he published this Principia Mathematica that it's considered, the origin of the modern physics. He was the father of that, and he requires a lot of calculus. I will not go in detail, but he knew to reinvent or invent part of new mathematical tools to demonstrate that. And that's why Isaac Newton is considered sometimes the father of the differential equations. It's something that is shared with Leibniz and Guillaume de l'Hôpital. these three mathematics were the ones that creating this idea of differential equations that were needed, to frame this. But just, as a kind of example, so we started with the Egyptian astronomers that 5,000 years ago identified those patterns. Thanks to the data collected by Tychos, we were with this high quality of data that allows, Kepler to reframe or, to change completely the astronomy view. And finally, with Newton, we started having these global rules that are not only applied with the placement of movements that we use usually in classical physics. I like very much this concept because I think it's only in few cases in which we started from the data and we end up what we call wisdom, fully understanding the planet movement. And in some cases, this requires, in identifying new tools, mathematical tools to describe. So now let's think. This was a nice example. Can we think about that? Are we reaching such a kind of wisdom in other type of phenomena? I would say that we are still, and going back, well, in many cases, we're still in this process of collecting data and retrieving some information. And in some cases, we have some knowledge, but it's very rare that we reach the wisdom level, understanding fully what is going on. And one of the main problems, as you will see, and now I will address mostly environmental data, we can see that the problems we address are significantly much more difficult, in a sense, particularly that we are considering a wide range of scales. There are phenomena that are all mixed, and some of them are happening in a matter of seconds, or in scales between seconds and minutes and millimeters, up to hundreds of years and thousands of kilometers. So altogether are mixed. Whenever we go to the field and we observe nature, we have climatic effects, weather effects, and if we think or observe organisms, even behavioral effects, that behavior could be in a matter of seconds. So it's very difficult to address all these things because of this higher complexity of multi-scale phenomena. So whenever we observe a phenomenon like this, whenever we go to nature and we try to ask yourself why these things are happening, or first of all, which are the patterns we need to identify, there is these questions about, okay, whenever I go in temporal observations, should I take the data every hour, every week, every day, every month, every second? And the same happened with geographical or spatial observations. Should I take every meter, every kilometer? And if you think in biologicals, should I collect information about every single species? I have to go to communities. So this is the kind of questions we need to address. And also we need to try to evaluate up to which point such a kind of option or selection could infer or affect the patterns we retrieve. So let's imagine just that we will try to analyze this in a single station. It's very common because of such a kind of complexity that sometimes people put all the effort on going to in a particular place and try at least to get the data from that place. And usually, so the experimental design, there are two main questions: for how long I need to record data, and how often I need to collect that data. And usually this goes basically not for scientific questions or addressing, but usually we have several technological constraints, or if you want, practical constraints. Our budget, usually we need some funding. Our funding is limited, and maybe I don't know if we think that we will take an automatic system, automatic record. This device has some limitations on the memory. We need certain power supplies. If we need to transmit the data, also it could have some cost on that. All these kind of things limits our capability of collecting data. This limitation could be even harder if we need to collect, analyze by ourselves, or look at the microscope, or taking some measurements. So we need to always deal with or address the problem with that we will have limited number of samples. So if we have limited number of samples, let's think about that we have like two potential strategies. The one is, okay, let's put all the samples in a very short period. So we concentrate all our measurements in a short period, or are we thinking on addressing larger scale, and then we will spread all this limited number of values in different at more scarce measurements? How this will affect our system? In many cases, and it's accepted that, okay, if I want to address things that happen at weekly basis, I will put all my effort during 1 week, and then I collect all the data during 1 week, and this I will get some understanding on what is happening at the weekly basis. If on the other case it's seasonal or yearly base, okay, then I will spread all my data for along 1 year or 2 years or whatever I decide. But at to which point this is true? So when we say this, there is, if you want, a trade-off between the length of our observations, so how long it will take our observations, and the resolution of our observations. And the question is how these choices of length and resolution may affect the retrieved information. So this is the two questions we will try to address right now. How long and how often? And the case of how long, we will, as you will see, we will start with a theoretical case, and then we will get some patterns on this theoretical, and we will see up to which point we retrieve that with practical data. And particularly, you will see it will be the first example of citizen science. So in many cases, when there is no data, some researchers try to evaluate this with a theoretical model. And this was the case, in the midst of the past century. Two researchers, Vito Volterra and Alfred Lotka, tried to identify which were the interactions between prey and predators. And for this, they created a theoretical model in which they provide some feedbacks, negative or positive feedbacks, depending on what makes, increase the population of predators, or what makes decrease the predators, or in the same way, and prey. And they consider that, for example, the way that the population decreased in the case of predator was the mortality of them. And in the case of the prey, it was the removal of prey by predators. In the case of prey, the positive was the birth rate of prey, and the second was the growth of predators. So if they eat more prey, they can grow. This can be translated in mathematical expressions, and they use these differential equations, the ones that I mentioned that Newton created for the movement of the astronomy bodies. So you can see that in many cases, people address this using differential equations. I will not go in detail, but usually these differential equations have some parameters that we need to consider. And you can see here, there are several parameters like the prey growth rate or the rate of removal of prey by predators. We can use these parameters, put it in that differential equations, and try to solve them. And you will see two examples of this solving, and you can see that there could be different scenarios depending on the values of those parameters that are, describing the equations. What is interesting in those cases is that Vito Volterra and Alfred Lotka, they found that in some cases, depending on the parameters, the populations oscillates. And basically, you can think in terms of, if you want, intuitively. So at the beginning, imagine that we are in this position. So there are enough prey, so the predators grow, and because they grow, they reduce the number of prey, and they decrease the number of prey. And there is one point that then the predators start decreasing because there are less and less prey. Up to which point that then there is very low number of predator, and this allows the prey to grow. They grow, and again, and this may happen, this idea of oscillations. And this type of oscillations, you can see that depending on the parameters, they change the period. So this could be interesting to know when or which is the classical period of this type of oscillations. But if now, as I mentioned, this was a theoretical approach. But anytime you go to the field and you collect some data, some people there is this big debate that sometimes people consider that those models are too simplistic, because as you remember, I mentioned only few aspects to make growing the predators and the prey. And they say, guys, when we go to the real world, the situation is much more complex. And I put you one example, and these are experimental results in one field work done in Patagonia, in Chile, in which the researchers studied the prey from the diets. They used to analyze the excrements, identify different preys. And you can see that the same, look how complex is the system. There are two predators, and they are not just a single prey, there are many preys. And even though in some cases, one of the predators could predate also to the predator. So sometimes the predator and prey. So there is this big debate up to which point these theoretical approaches provide useful information. During this debate, there was one researcher that they found a very interesting time series. And this time series is somehow related to citizen scientists. You can see here, it was the time series that are collected in the Hudson Bay Company. I don't know if you are familiar with this company. This company had the rights to exploit the furs commerce for many years in Canada, in the one Canadian area, in this what is called Rupert's Land. It's, if you want, a very colonialist situation. Imagine that some people decide that one company could exploit all the commerce of furs in such a huge extension, and it was only a single company. And that company was Hudson Bay. And nearly 2 centuries, they were able to, they had the right, to make the commercialization of furs, because at that time, furs commerce was very, very, successful. So I put here 2 examples. So they record, and you can see the numbers of furs market by Hudson Bay Company between nearly a century, 90 years. And in these 90 years, they collect all these furs, and you can see the amount of furs. We are talking, this is 40,000 furs or 80,000 and 120 furs. So we are talking a lot of animals hunted at that time. But that's very interesting, because we are collecting 90 years of data that basically was the hunting activity. If we think, basically, Hudson Bay, one of the most important ways to obtain data was by exchanging furs with indigenous people. And you can see how different could be the indigenous people, because the extension of this Rupert's Land was enormous. It was more than 6 times the Iberian Peninsula. Imagine the Iberian Peninsula is quite big. You multiply by 6, and you have more or less that extension. And you can see now here just a few numbers of the original or nations, indigenous nations that were living in that area. Just a few, because there are much more. Obviously, all of them, they have different ways of hunting, different situations, different populations. You can consider that between these 90 years, probably there were, I don't know, disasters, epidemics, any kind of things. People were born, people started hunting with very inexperience. There were very experienced hunters that they died because it was 90 years. So even that, not all, I would say, uncontrolled elements, you can see that the patterns, it was quite cycling. And it's very curious, because more or less the peaks are more or less around 10 years. So with this big data, we are starting having some patterns that they were very curious and very interesting, because basically it's saying that maybe this idea of beta lot can Volterra were not so wrong, despite that there will be a large number of complexity. We identified that there is cycles, and a classical cycle that more or less remains more or less constant around 10 years for 90 years. I have not found the sources, but it seems that several anthropologists, they know that all these nations, they know maybe centuries in advance this type of cycle. It was a local knowledge in which they say that there were good periods for hunting, bad periods for hunting. And for them was very critical. because that part of hunting could suppose, they survive. So it seems that they knew for maybe 2 or 3 centuries that there was this cycling period. So I'm very curious to find the original sources, but it would be very interesting to know to which point this local knowledge could mention that this type of cycles were reminded even not only during 90 years, but even, centuries. One of the big questions then is, why 10 years? Why not 5 years? Why not 15 years? And these are the questions we can address thanks to, I would say, this is a kind of citizen sense data, because obviously the people involved on that, they were not academics. They were hunting for surviving, to survive or to live. But this is the type of data that is very rare to collect in, I would say, academic scenario. Imagine 6 times the Iberian Peninsula extension and 90 years of data. It's impossible to imagine something as a scientific program covering such a kind of period and extension. And addressing then the how long. Imagine that we reduce a little bit, the extension. So we are not going from 9 years, we are going to a much shorter period. Even 6 years could be considered a long period within the academic framework, 6 years of data. But you can see that depending on when you choose those 6 years, the patterns are completely different. In the first case, it seems that that the links will disappear because it's decreasing very fast. And if we use, I would say, normal trends, patterns, and we use, for example, a linear regression, you can see that the regression coefficient is very high. And we could say that it's a very negative trend. The links will disappear for sure if we collect only these 6 years. Well, if we go to another 6 years, it's in the opposite, completely on the opposite way. It seems that, wow, the links are skyrocketing. And this, I would say, nearly false patterns is because we are looking at a very too narrow window time frame. We need to have longer periods to understand that this is a cycling period. And imagine that in how many cases people are extracting, regular patterns and so on, only with 3, 4, 5 years of just collecting data, because it's the classical situation nowadays in research that you are funded for 3 years or 4, and you need to identify what is going on only with 3 or 4 years of data. And you can see which is the potential danger on addressing this in a short, narrow period. So we can see that how critical could be answering this how long question. So let's go now to the second part, how often? And to go for that, we will try to split a little bit. You will see that we make a survey among experts. We ask them how often you are collecting the data. We will evaluate such a kind of results, and we will try to also to evaluate those choices in a, I would say, nearly realistic scenario. You will see how it goes. So first, it was in a monocle project a few years ago, and we asked to the researchers, how long or when, how often are you collecting the data? And we asking in 3 possible different scenarios. When you try to sample to meet regulations, environmental regulations, what is called operational sampling. Operational means regularly. If you are collecting data in a regular way, how often you are collecting data? And in some cases, how often you will collect the data if you want to capture all the variability of the phenomena you are studying. And this was these potential choices. Are you collecting seasonally, monthly, weekly, and so on? And we found these answers when we evaluate the data. In many cases, there is a kind of general agreement that anytime that you have to sample to meet regulations, seasonal or monthly sampling would be enough. You can see that the major people answer to that choice. In the case of operational or regular sampling, most of them are sampling monthly. Any kind of time series that they are collecting in a regular way, usually they choose one sample every month. And when there is the need or to adequate the capture to capture all the variability here, there is not so much consensus. Some people say, no, we need to go up to weekly sampling, others say daily, and others even say hourly, okay? So let's imagine that more or less, but it seems that there are more or less consensus in these two and a little bit different in that one. how to answer this or how to evaluate or analyze this part. So we will try to evaluate this in a very long series. So imagine we obtain it. And what I would say is not real data, but it's very realistic data. It's data that it was supposed to collect it during nearly 11 years of the daylight or the amount of light you could record by radiometer in some cases, but in this case it's irradiance, in some cases by a photometer. But imagine that during 11 years you collect that data every 50 minutes. And this ends up with this nearly 700,000 values. And we will imagine that time series as the real one. And then we will try to apply. First, let's try to find these patterns. Every peak of that corresponds to 1 year. If we zoom off this, we can start having some variability, but we can see the summer samples. Those summer samples, if we zoom a bit, then we identify what is the classical. This is during the day, and this is during the night. Okay, so basically what we can see is that is these patterns, that there is daylight and of obviously darkness during the night and so on. And we see that the peak is usually at 24 hours. We go to winter samples, we can see that the similar patterns, so the peaks are smaller because we have less light during winter, but the peaks also are every 24 hours. And in many cases here, we have decreasing, not only because of the position of the sun, but also because of the clouds. And that's why in some cases we have cloudy days. And these are sunny days, and these are cloudy days, okay? So basically, these is the patterns that we are very, I would say, there is no discussions on that. I think that all of us agree that during 1 year, we are expecting to have 365 cycles of day and night. In fact, technically it's 365.25 because, every 4 years we need to add one day. But we can explain all this because now we know that the Earth is moving around the sun, again, in an elliptic way, and there is a kind of tilt, and this tilt creates the seasons. This is something that now we study in primary schools, but it was very difficult to understand in the past. But I think that everybody agrees on that. So now what we will do is, having this time series that I suppose all of us agree, let's do the experiment that what happens if we do not sample as often as every 15 minutes, but if we split or we expand or extend, the sampling rate. And this is what we get. We have chosen, more or less as what is called subdaily resolution. So that subdaily resolution means that we are collecting more than 365 observations every year. And you can see that in one case, we collect more than 400, in particular 417, in the other 394, and the other 373. What we obtain, it's clearly something that, and particularly in the last one, an artificial pattern. You can see it's a strange pattern because you can see that here, if we count, what we see is that we have 8 cycles of light darkness. It's saying that we could record, basically 8 days per year, which we know it's wrong. And in that case, it's 29 cycles per year and 52. All of them are wrong because I suppose that none of us will be, well, maybe in some parts of the Earth, it goes like this. No, it's an artifactual, problem because we are not sampling with high sampling frequency. When we reduce the sampling frequency, this may happen. We are starting having these artifactual problems. And if you can see that if we stand not only for 1 year, but for 3 years, we obtain 52, 52, 52, and the other 29, 29, 29, 8, 8, 8. So in many cases, if the people only rely on that time series, come on, 3 years. In all these 3 cases, more than 1,000 samples, no error. That pattern is for sure right. No, it's not right. You can see that it's something that it's wrong. And this is well known. I put this example, but I have to tell you that this type of effect, it's mathematically very well described. The mathematical background says that imagine that this is the original in green time series, and if we do not take enough data, we can reconstruct like this, and this is called aliased data. Aliasing is something that is very well known, and as you can see, many of the authors that were involved in this sampling theory, the first idea comes from Edmund Whittaker in 1915, so more than 100 years ago. It was a mathematician, Scottish mathematician, that he started asking himself, how many points do I need to interpolate perfectly one equation? And these people are more related to practical things. These two are, they work at Bell Laboratories, because this part of the sampling was, the basis to make things digital. Now everything is digital. Now we are communicating, and my video, it's transmitted to numbers that travels through internet and goes to your screen. And my voice, everything is digital. But it's digital thanks that these people identify this problem and identify also at which sample rate we need to sample just to avoid this. So this is something very new that, for me, surprisingly, sometimes is not well applied it's completely applied in engineering, in terms of music and video, whatever you want, but this may happen also with environmental data. So basically, I'm trying to summarize, sorry, I will go in this way. We have two choices. As we mentioned, high resolution. We concentrate the data and put the data at high resolution, but very short period. The problem that we may have is the one that we show here. That the problem is that sometimes with high resolution, as I mentioned the example with the links data, maybe the short window provides, strange patterns or somehow a little bit false patterns. And the same may happen when we try to address large coverture, but the problem is that when we got large coverture, the sampling rate could be too slow, and we can find this, I would say, artificial time series, aliased series. So as you can see, neither the high resolution short time nor the large coverture at lower resolution could address everything, and there can be potential problems on retrieving the patterns. And if we retrieve wrongly the patterns, obviously we may have then problems on identifying what is the mechanisms behind all these phenomena. So this is what we call the need of observational paradigm shift. We need to move, and we will try to get large coverture, but at high resolution, both in temporal, but in spatial as well. And this requires a lot more data than the one we are collecting right now. And this is very challenging. And this is the main problem. So we can see, if you want, is that when we say, how can data quality affect the correct identifications of patterns and trends, short-term and long-term observations with infrequent data may have significant limitations in detecting the real patterns. And despite the accuracy, because we have not talked about accuracy here, because we have assuming that all the measurements we are dealing here are correct. There are zero error. It's not a problem of accuracy. It's a problem of completeness. So we need more data. Basically, we need more data, no matter how accurate. If we do not collect in the proper rate in terms of coverture and frequency, we can have wrong patterns. So let's try then, in the second part, addressing this problem and how we can address this multidimensional quality of data in practice, and the role of citizen science in this solving problems. So again, if we need more data from all places and all times, there are like two options. We create technology, I would say, more sophisticated technology that is capable to collect this data, or to involve people, because people are everywhere all the time. So if we need more data everywhere all the time, let's integrate people, let's engage people and help us in collecting such a kind of needed data. And this is basically the idea. I have to tell you that in many cases, when people think about citizen science, it's a kind of interaction between academic community and people, but we as you will see, sometimes we think that it should be a little bit more complex. We just not consider academic community and participatory, but sometimes we need other type of community. Mobilizing community are the ones that are in direct contact with people and help on engage them in collecting the data. And facilitating community usually are governmental organizations that facilitate participation. We will see examples of that. But we think that in many cases, the interaction between communities is a little bit more complex than just people and academics. And the second thing, and it's very important, is in the role of citizen observatories. We think that citizen observatories, we will see one example, are the platforms that allows to develop citizen science activities. And we think that sometimes those observatories needs to interact with the communities in a very different way. For example, in the case of people are expecting that the system provides feedback very soon. I upload one picture and the system provide me thanks, but in a minute, not months before. Also, if I'm uploading something and I don't know exactly if it's right or wrong, people are expecting some answers in a matter more just a few days. Otherwise, they get bored. They feel that the system is not responding, and in many cases, they do not want to continue because they feel that the system is not providing, they do not care, the system do not care what they are doing. So it's very important, this type of short interactions. While in the case of academic and the facilitating, academics usually we are very much used to have, that we collect data for many months and years, and we produce the paper or whatever in a matter of in a question of months or even years. So there is a kind of long-term interactions between academics and sometimes even governments, while the participatory community requires some short-term interactions. And mobilizing is a kind of bridge between those. We mentioned this idea of that then the system needs like two different phases, and that's why we use the term Janus. Janus, it was a methodology, a god of two phases, and we think that the system needs two phases that interacts with the community in a very different way. And that's why we call it Janus. And if you want, as a kind of example, we work with one platform that it's called Minca. Minca, it's a Quechua name, a Quechua term that means collective work in favor of the community. It's a term of Quechua origin. It's a pre-Columbian tradition in which people from a village, for example, anytime that there is a need for an activity, imagine that collect, why not? Let's go to my garden and to collect some vegetables. Let's do a Minca, and all the people in the village go there and help me on collecting the vegetables, or maybe building a house or whatever. And this for us, it was nice, this idea of this collective work for the community. That's why we name it Minca. It comes from originally from iNaturalist, but we are adapting a bit. The main importance for us is that Minca can work within the academia in a single language, but usually this interaction that I mentioned, these two phases in local communities are doing in local languages. It's very important to have the system in local languages because people usually require this interaction in their own language. And that's why, it's very important to have such a kind of thing, despite that I would say internationally, here there are many people that have many different languages. I'm pretty sure that easily we can find 5 or 6 or even more languages. We use English as a normal one. But whenever there is interactions, these interactions locally needs to be done in local languages. And which is the idea? The idea is, as I mentioned, this idea of having 4 types of communities. That's why sometimes we call it participatory living labs or community of practice. So we have this, and we can imagine there are several of these interactions between academics, people mobilizing and facilitating in different areas. We create living labs with local initiatives, but then we try to address global issues, global questions, through the interactions at the very local system. So let's put an example about these challenges, and in this case, in this large scale monitoring that I mentioned. And particularly, we try to address this organizing large-scale events. We call it biomarathons. I suppose that many of you are familiar with BioBlitz. BioBlitz is very short time, very fast. Why we use biomarathons? In particular, in the case of the sea, if you organize a BioBlitz, it's quite risky because if the weather is bad and during 2 or 3 years, you organize the whole BioBlitz and then people even cannot get into the sea because it's rough or there is, to hatch waves or whatever, and you cannot do anything. If you extend the BioBlitz to a biomarathon, it's long term, for example, all the summer season, then you allow that, well, one day maybe the weather is rough and the sea you cannot go, but you can go the following day. And that's basically this idea, extending the BioBlitz to long term. And that's what we call biomarathon, well, and we have created this in the context of several projects, and we engage, as you will see. As you can see, there are several people or several communities. The one is the participatory community. Obviously, the people are the ones that they dive in some cases, and they snorkel in many cases because we think in terms. All the data is recorded in Minka. And we have the mobilizing community, are these school NGOs that explain to the volunteers how to go to the field, and even sometimes giving them or facilitating them, the dress. Not all the people has swimming dresses to use it, or cameras or mask or whatever. And for example, in our case, facilitating community in many cases are the city councils, and particularly here it's one example. The city council in Barcelona, they allow us to have meetings with the mobilizing community and academics. Sometimes I offer one facility and we have several meetings explaining why it's so important, the data collection in these cases. We can train people on how to identify several species and so on. And this was done, in particular, the first example I will mention is in a particular area in Spain, in the north, in the Catalonia areas where we live. And also, I always say that citizen science, it's local science. We need to interact with the people. We need to snorkel with them sometimes, because an essential thing is this emotional binding. They need to feel part of the community, and we need to interact with them. And that's very important, and that's why we created. One of the important things, or the platform needs to facilitate the participation, and it's very common in particularly in the marine domain, that people say, I wish to participate, I'm willing to volunteer, but anytime that I go to the sea and I take a picture of organism, I have no idea what I'm taking. Don't care. Just upload the picture, and then the community can help you on identifying that species. So there are many people that report one species. I don't know. Okay, could you help me? Yes, and the community helps. And this idea, if you're behind Minka on this collaborative identification, there are many people that are much more experienced and that they can help you on identifying. So we create what is called the community identification. So going then to this idea of local activities. I put you just one example. There is one part in south of Barcelona in which there is one particular area that is protected, and the people around that area are very concerned on that particular area to be, well known and very, better conservated. And that's why there is the city council. There is one company or organization there, local organization, are the ones that are mobilizing the rest of the community, and we are supporting through Minka, but you can see they are collecting very locally that observations on that particular site. You can see that thanks to the biomarathons, how the participation has increased year by year. So we are engaged in enlarging the community, and there are more and more and more people that are willing to participate at the local level. And this is basically what we did. So you can see that in 2023, they say, wow, we reached more than 100,000 observations, historical record. But you can see that more or less 4 years later, we multiply by 3 this now. At 2025, there was 300,000. Now we have more than 400,000. Probably this year we will end up with 500,000 observations along the coast. And this is very important because not only we are increasing the observations, but also we are increasing the participation all along the coast. And this is the key point. We are creating such a kind of, I would say, observational paradigm shift. As I mentioned, we need large extension with high resolution. It's 600, nearly 600 kilometers of coast and the Earth sampled. And now we are providing information every 10 kilometers, square by square. And this is the kind of observations we may need to identify patterns and to regularly, provide such a kind of huge volume of data year by year. Because since we are doing this every year, we are collecting this and we can see changes through the years. In some cases, we identify new species that were regularly seen in the past now are not seen, or there are new species, and how all these kind of things change. But this can be done, in large scale, but at the same time, high resolution, which was one of the demands that I mentioned in the first part. And do you remember that I say long-term, but also high resolution? This is what we are achieving by engaging all these type of people. Now, obviously, we have started this, but now you can see that we are extending in several European projects, which is the dream. The dream is that at the end, you can see red in all the coast system, not only the Mediterranean, but also in the Atlantic and so on. But obviously, we need to demonstrate this concept in a particular place, the one that we can create such a kind of local communities. And obviously, we will do it, this interacting with the people. And obviously, or hopefully, then the Greeks say, we like it, this idea. We will do the same. Perfect. You do it in Greek, the Turkish, I don't know, in North Africa, in Morocco, but obviously in Morocco they will do it in Arab or French or whatever they decided to do. One important thing, and now going back to data quality, say, okay, you are collecting a lot of data, but how you evaluate such a kind of data? Well, the good thing is that we are collecting so many pictures of some particular species that this creates, for example, in this particular case, or not grass, at that time, because this was past year, but we had nearly 2,000 pictures of that fish. That means that we have this fish, you can see, with water background, rocky, in many different positions. All these type of pictures could use later on for training artificial intelligence systems that identify such a kind of a species. And that's what we are working now. We are working what we call hybrid intelligence. In the past, I mentioned here people, but imagine that we combine people with artificial agents. So there are opinions from the humans, but also from the artificial intelligence. And this collective system is the one that we think that we can speed up also, the feedback. And I remember in this Janus that we say people need fast answers. If the system increase, we need this kind of artificial intelligence that help us at least to identify the most common species. Okay. And you can see, for example, that thanks to this type of things, we are collecting very rare species. This was the first time that this crab was identified in the area. It seemed that it was because of illegal trade market. They bring it from the north of Africa and they use it for fishing, which is not allowed. So we identify this, but it's very important because it's a potential, invasive species. And then we identified that there was illegal market with this type of species, and we could stop it. And this is very important in terms of conservation. Okay, this was the first example. Let's move to the second one. The second one is a little bit different. It's one of the environmental observation. It's about how to monitor water quality and particularly water transparency. I identify here, how different in terms of optics could be. This is the harbor of Barcelona, and this is the outside of the harbor, and you can see how different is the water masses. Even from the sky, from the remote sensing, we can see big difference. But usually this type of water is the one that you can see here, very turbid, very difficult to see, while this in many cases could be like this. So in many cases, we can use these optical properties to identify or to connect with water quality. One of the simplest way to do that, so to measure water transparency, was one design proposed by Pietrangelo Secchi, that basically it's a plastic with a rope. So I drop this plastic in the water column, as you can see here, and I can drop it down to a particular depth in which I cannot see anymore that disk. And this gives me what is called the Secchi depth. The more turbid the water, the closer to the surface it will disappear. Okay, there is a kind of variant, is a smaller one that it was proposed by George Whipple, but basically that's the same idea. Just a rope and a plastic. Very simple. And that's why it was measured many years. For example, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but this happened in Lake Tahoe in, in the United States, that during the 60s, 70s, when they dropped the Secchi disk, the Secchi disappeared nearly at 30 meters. But you can see at the beginning of this century that depth decreased a lot. And this creates a concern about the problem that the Lake Tahoe was more and more turbid, and this needs to be changed. And now there are a lot of conservation efforts to going back to the clarity that it was in the previous. There are several now, because it's so simple, the device, that we can use it in many places. And there is one example is Secchi Dipin, and you can see many different water bodies. Many people drop this type of instruments, and there is a huge data collection of this type of measurements. And this can create, you can see maps, and we can see trends. And they have classified, for example, those lakes in which the Secchi depth remain more or less stable, in which has decreased, in which the one has increased. And this is thanks to the citizens, the volunteers, participatory activities. You can see here, for example, some statistic: 118 lakes were decreased, while 190 lakes was increased, for example. And this can be done with participants. But we try to go one step further, and first, to understand this, it's important that to understand that there is a system called Global Ocean Observing System, GOOS, that has defined several variables that needs to be monitored regularly. They call it these essential ocean variables. Among them, one of them is this water transparency, but it's not used with the Secchi disk. It is a little bit more complicated. I will explain a little bit more, but it's first you measure the light at different depths, and from these depths measured at different lights, we can estimate what is called the diffusion attenuation coefficient. We will see what does it mean, but basically it is a way, to measure also the water transparency. What is important is that experts, when they say, okay, this is one of the essential variables we need to measure, to monitor, and they evaluate, they link this magnitude to water quality, but they also evaluate which could be the ranges in which that value could change. And you can see it's quite ambitious, because they say, in many cases, it may change every hour or every week. And it changes also in a matter of 1 kilometer up to 100 kilometers. So we need to cover a wide range of temporal and spatial scales if we want to cover from hours to weeks and from kilometers to hundreds of kilometers. So this is quite challenging to do that. How we can do that? First, let's understand what does it mean, this KD. Basically, what we measure is the light at different depths, and it is assumed that this light decreases using this type of formula. I will not go in detail, but basically you can see that in this formula, this is this parameter KD, that is the one that we will measure. How to measure this? Well, just a tricky thing, we convert this measurement of light in logarithmic scale, and this curve, then it's converted or transformed in a line, and basically we have to measure the slope of this line. The slope of this line is the one that provides this parameter. So one of the first questions or address in terms of data quality, we say, okay, if we need to measure the light, we need sensors, very accurate sensors. As long as we have very accurate sensors, we can obtain these values very accurate, and then we can estimate that slope. And this is one of the underwater sensors, light sensors that you can buy in the market, are not cheap, but usually are not cheap. We are talking about thousands of euros or thousands of dollars, but they promise you that they are following all what is called, in many cases, calibration certificates that allows you to certify that this instrument will provide very accurate measurements, which is one of the options. But we have to think that it's not only a problem of the accuracy, but also the environmental conditions. One of the problems that we can find is that usually the sea is not flat, there is waves. And these waves act as a kind of lens. And part of this lens concentrate the light and others disperse the light. And this create on any time, I suppose you are sometimes familiar, when it's very clear day and there is sunny day, you can see at the bottom this kind of reticular. This is because of this wave focusing. Here, the light has been concentrated a lot, while in other places has been dispersed. And this creates a lot of variability on the light. So no matter how accurate, you have a very high variability, and not because of the water transparency, because of the wave. Depending on the wave you have, you will have these changes of light. And obviously also another thing that can change the light measurements if there is cloud or not, okay? There was one experiment in the past, in 2011, with a very sophisticated instrument. You can see that instrument. It was deployed in Hawaii, and they measured with many, many different sensors all the light changes. And I want to show you one of these records. These are 2 minutes. And in 2 minutes, you can see how light was changing. Some of these big changes is because of this wave focusing. Depending on the wave, when there is concentration and all the lights goes, what happened then? The light skyrocketing. We have very high values of light because of this concentration. When then it moves like this, it decreases. Okay? And also, when there is some clouds, the values reduce a lot. So you can see that in just 2 minutes, how different could be the light measurement. And we are interested on the mean value, not on this all, but this affects the measurement. So if we are taking just one measurement very fast, we may have this value or this value or this value, depending. And this is a little bit challenging. One of the things is, okay, let's take a lot of measurements and then try to make an average. But this requires fast sampling systems and also some computing systems. What is the problem? The problem is that we want that these are the average values, and sometimes we have these very, I would say, changing curves because of these wave effects. And we want the gray one, but we get this one. And this complicates a little bit, later on, the measurement of this light extinction coefficient. How we solved this? We started working with very low-cost sensors. You can see we created a buoy, and this buoy has several sensors, and these sensors are very cheap. You can buy it at the internet. It costs around €1. And this is a light that you use in domotic systems. It was something, and we put at different depths. And basically, these sensors do not provide you a digital value. Rather than that, they just oscillate. They oscillate electrically, and they said the more light, the higher the frequency. So obviously, here that we have more light because we are closer to the surface, the system that sensor oscillate in this way, and the bottom one in this way. If the water is very transparent, the difference between the oscillations is very small. If the water is very turbid, the difference of light are very high, and then the differences of frequencies are very also different as well. How to process all this? What we use, it's called Arduino. Arduino, if you are not familiar with that, it's a commercial electric card that you can buy also at the internet, and it's quite common, well known, because it's used in many school projects. There are many school people, and you can see, for example, people that they create their own garden controller based on this, many things. And because of that, we thought that it was a very useful device to develop, do-it-yourself systems. And this is basically what we did. Which is the advantage of this system? Well, as you remember, I mentioned this idea of wave focusing and clouds. that may change completely, the frequency of a single sensor. But if we allow for a relatively large period of time, anytime when there is high concentration, the system will oscillate very fast, but when it reduces, it will starting slower. But if we count the number of pulses, it's the average light. So we don't need a very sophisticated system. Rather than that, just we need to leave it for a relatively long period of time. If we do it, we will get an average value. And this is what we did. And you can see the result. Here you can see the light extinction coefficient obtained with this very low-cost system compared with professional radiometers. You can see that, well, it's quite well correlated. There is a kind of bias because ideally it should be here, but because we can identify the bias, we can correct it, and finally we get these values. As you can see here, the values that are provided by Arduino are very much similar to those provided by commercial radiometers. And we need to consider that those radiometers, the price is between $9,000 and $20,000, compared to the Arduino prices is 150. So similar measurements with very different systems. The main advantage is not only the price, that it's also that these devices can be built by the people. What we did in school workshops, we teach students how to build their own system. We explain them, and also we allow to name them. So they are, it's my own device. I'm device curator, and that's very also important. Again, this emotional binding. If I consider my device, I will curate my device. I will be very happy that this device is providing data all over the world. And it's something that we did. For example, we collaborate with some people in Canada. In Canada, in some areas, there are many lakes, and in these lakes are very different. So we can install these systems in many different, but because they have the name and we put it on internet, people were really proud that they see the name of the school, the user, but also the name of the boy, and say, my boy is measuring in Canada now. Wow. So they were very much, interested on doing that. And you can see that, I'm not going details, but sometimes we get very different measurements. Also, we tested, for example, in one week of science, and we put some in Barcelona, close to the harbor, but not so close to the harbor. It was in the beaches, so I would say more or less clear waters. While in Alphax Bay is close to Ebro Delta. Ebro Delta provides, because of the effect of the river, it's usually turbid waters with a lot of phytoplankton at much more turbid waters. And you can see the difference between Alphax and Barcelona, much higher in Alphax, obviously because it's much more turbid, but also difference on time. Because in March and in May there are much more phytoplankton, and that's why it increased, and it's the same happened. So we can explain also, differences on different places, why in some places we found more turbid water than the other, and also why they change through the year. And this is a way also to engage students. And one of the important things is that because everything is electronic, we can do quality control automatically. Sometimes because of the movement of the boy or whatever happened, we can have some rare measurements. But when we treat statistically, you can see, I will not go in detail, just keep in mind that this value needs to be very high. Anytime that something wrong happens, that statistics drops. So I can put a threshold and say, all these values that are below that threshold, I need to eliminate. And that's automatically a data correction system. This cannot be done, for example, with manual SECI disk, but with this electronic SECI disk, this can be done because all this process. So we can create such a kind of, I would say, automatic system. And this was basically what we publish in this, we call it operational monitoring with do it yourself. Operational means that automatically we get corrected data or validated data. Which is the dream? The dream is, rather than having very, localized elements, you have seen that the problem on having only few, we can imagine that we can engage community collecting data all over the coasts. again, the experts identify that this can change from few kilometers, I would say even few hundred meters in some cases, up to hundreds of kilometers. With all these kind of instruments or measurements, we could also be able to identify which are the changes in the coastal areas because of the changes of phytoplankton, sediment suspension, any different types. Okay, this is the idea behind that. Also, and it's important as well. That means that everything can be done with citizen science. No, but imagine our idea is that ideally we want to measure in all along the coast. If we had very accurate systems all along the coast, would be the perfect scenario. We can get all the stations with high accuracy, and we get the pattern of interest that we can later on analyze. This would be the pattern or reference. In real options, we have like two options. We select just few stations, and then we get very good values on that, but then there could be this error when we interpolate. Or we can engage people knowing that whenever we engage people, in some cases, the accuracy will decrease. So we can have this kind of cloud values here. But if we make, for example, a regression, you can see that the pattern here looks like very much that the reference rather than that one, but with a little bit of bias. The advantage is that we combine accurate measurements with those collected by people, we can end up with something that is very close to the real one. And that's basically the magic for us combination. Let's leave the academics to use expensive instruments that provides accurate measurements in only few cases, but this can give us some clues about if there is any potential bias by the citizens. But the citizens can provide the global pattern and follow in a much better way. And that's basically the combination. So basically, taking home message about how quality needs to be addressed. Well, needs to consider that it's a multidimensional concept. We have seen that completeness plays a very important role. In some cases, could be even higher than the accuracy. We have seen that participants probably are the ones that can address better the completeness dimension, but also then in terms of accuracy, probably academics can concentrate on collecting accurate reference data that can identify any potential bias, and combining all of them, that's probably the best time series we can address for our needs to understand the system, considering, this pyramid from data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And basically, this is what I wanted to show you. And it's now time for a few questions if people want to address anything.
Thank you so much, Jaume. It's been so fascinating. I think we didn't just learn about the concepts of data in citizen science, but also about so many different thematic, like from nature to astronomy to electronics. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. Thank you so much. I have lots of questions in my head, but I don't want to take the time from the audience. So please feel free to raise your hand and ask away any questions you have to Jaume. There were a few mentions in the chat, Jaume, about some projects, if they're collaborations in India. It was someone who asked HQ. Would you like to unmute yourself if you're still here? No, and then Anupoma also asked about collaborations with Austria or Austrian schools or Austrian lakes. Anupoma?
If not, I think
the projects that you had with the school children, it fascinates me. It's so amazing, and it has so much to do with building confidence, do it yourself, and really take responsibility for your environment, your earth, on yourself. Yeah. So it comes with so many good things. So I was just wondering if something similar could be done with Austrian schools, with Austrian lakes. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Also, we think that there could be different roles, because there are several people, we say that within the schools or in general, there could be some people that they love to make things, what we call it makers. So they love, I'm a little bit like this, geeks, that they like electronics and so on, and maybe they are not so comfortable, or they are not enjoying going to the field. But don't worry, you can be concentrated on creating the instrument and then send to those people that they prefer to go to the field, maybe rowing, potting, whatever. And there are also that are more analytics. They collect that data and they analyze. So we can have like different roles and even different schools. There are some schools could be very technical, and the teacher want to teach about Arduinos or whatever else, while others are, for example, in natural sciences or whatever, and they collect this. And we are trying to promote this idea of collaboration with different roles and different, different ideas, and we think that it could be very nice. And at the end, in these platforms like Minka, that everything it's collected, you can retrieve some data, and maybe you like more identifying patterns, why in that lake it's, the values are different than that lake or whatever, and you understand then geographical issues, or why not, or temporal issues. You can apply for ecology or for climatic, or even you can record maybe historical data and compare what you are measuring right now. Yeah, I think that there's plenty of opportunities on that.
Thank you, Jaume. Santiago, you had your hand raised earlier. Would you like to ask or?
Yeah. I mean, it was a question that in a certain way you kind of responded here. So I'm going to do a second question that I had is about the granularity of the information. Like having data for having data. Like, to what point do you decide, okay, we have enough, and now we move on into the next stage, and we keep collecting.
Well, I think it's important that sometimes there is this eternal discussion that some people say, no, if you want to do science first, you have to ask the question. But for me, the questions appears after you identify the trend. So sometimes I'll strongly advocate of curiosity-driven science. So the idea, okay, let's discover first what is happening, and later on, when we obtain some patterns, then let's try to do the questions about those patterns. I try to convince you that if you are not collecting, I would say, with a lot of completeness and so on, the patterns you may obtain could be not the ones that are happening right now. I put the example of the light and so on. So if you have that pattern, maybe you create your questions that are completely, unrealistic. And that's why I try to convince that we need really to collect in massive data, this idea of big data production. Then the analytics can extract. It's like, are you Tycho Brahe or are you Kepler? In the example that I put, Kepler was really good on analyzing, very good, and Tycho was really good on obtaining the data. And without these fantastic researchers, all of them with their own abilities, we would not end up with the final, understanding what's happening. On top of that was Newton. But I think this may happen also in nature or in social sciences, that maybe we need Tycho Brahes and Keplers in the same way. And for me, curiosity that, just explore. And maybe you don't have questions. And even sometimes it's better not having questions, because then you collect without any pre-idea. Because sometimes if you have focus on, no, I have to find this, I have to find this, you are somehow, biased to try to find this. Let's explore. I don't know if I answered your question, but okay, thank you.
We have a double thumbs up. So thank you, Jaume. Claire and then Dorota.
Yeah, maybe I can leave the floor to Dorota and then ask my question. Go ahead, Dorota.
Thank you. I'll try to, well, okay. I'll try to be quick. Thank you very much for the talk. I have a question about initiatives like Biomarathon, because having experience with BioBlitzes myself, I know that they often feel like very one-time events, and there's really no repetition of that in the future. It's more often we had money for that, so we ran that, or we had capacity that year. How do you ensure like the long-term existence of initiatives like Biomarathon? Because I found it very interesting.
I think one of the key questions is the emotional binding and also this local, sometimes, the land or in that case, coastal stewardship. Let's save the world, but what is happening in the beach of my village? Because it's where my kids are, swimming, and I'm concerned about what is happening locally. And it's the place you can do most or better things locally. So that's why we try to create such a kind of local initiatives, own it and govern it by local people, because they are concerned about what is happening locally. We try to help them. For example, okay, guys, if you continue monitoring, we can help you on identifying the species you don't know, on creating tools that later on you can use on your own to identify local patterns or local concerns. For example, many people say, "Oh, I want to know if my area is healthy enough, or my ecosystem is good enough, or is there any problem in around the area where we live?" And this is the kind of motivation that ensures long-term participation, as long you also provide some answers. And sometimes you go with them and you snorkel with them and you discuss with them what is going on locally. And that's I mentioned this idea, very important, that we cannot go. People say, why you're not trying to apply now what you have done in Catalonia, maybe in Greece, or even in the south of Spain. I cannot go to the south of Spain because it takes me too long to go there. I need to convince someone else, some academics from the south of Spain, and they can do it on their own. We can help them in providing, the lessons learned, the infrastructure, all the codes, or everything that we are doing. But we think that it's really local-based things, and also this stewardship. There is one paper very, very, well, I will send you the reference. It's called The Power of Place. And it addresses this problem or this issue that people love locally, or they interact locally, and we need to convince them to act locally. Despite that, later on we can collect all the data, and then we can address global or large scale problems. But people act and live locally.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jaume. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much. Yeah, first of all, thank you, Jaume. I think I love the storytelling that you mixed with the data, and that really helped me understand the concept that you brought in. So thank you for that. I had a question around one of your slides that you showed the data temporality that was taken at different time scales, and that the different time scale didn't show the same picture. But I wonder if someone had zoomed out for a moment and aggregated and seen the overall pattern, could you not see the same time scale? But perhaps people didn't do this at that moment. So I don't remember exactly which example it was, but it was after you showed us the 6 years and 6 years, which was very interesting to see how indeed people may be taking results and assumptions out of the 6 years, but they don't consider that the phenomenon is more temporal, more cyclical, and that requires a lot of data across time. But then when you do have data across time, but you take it, for example, year to year instead of it was the 15-minute scale, you could get that same temporality if you look at the year to year together.
Yeah, well, it depends. But I give you an example. Imagine that something is cycling. Imagine that imagine that I said, following this idea of the light, we are collecting data every midday. Okay, if you are collecting every midday, you could identify in summer, at midday, the sun, it's stronger, so we have stronger light. But you miss the night. You will never collect night. No matter how long you take. If you take only at midday, you miss the night. And also, if you want to identify that in summer, the night is shorter than in winter, you need more data. Not only because I'll say, okay, let's do it midnight and midday. Okay, then you collect night and day. But if you want also to identify that there is during summer, the night time is shorter than in winter, you need more data. You need at least four or five samples or observations per day. Without having this, if you spend 20 years only collecting at midday and at midnight, you will never see this variance or variability along the seasons. And that's why we need increase this completeness. And that's basically what we need. And this is what people can do. And also they have experience. I'm pretty sure that if I show this time series to whoever now, 12, even 10 years old kids saying, God, Jaume, what did you do? We have much more cycles than 8 cycles per year, because it's our personal experience, our local experience. And they can identify very easily that something is going wrong. And that's why I put this example, because in the past, I show much more complex examples, and people, but maybe in here that, no, come on, guys. Then there has to be 365.25 cycles per year everywhere, unless, in the poles or in the north, that sometimes it's a permanent night and permanent. But whenever there is cycles, there is 365 for sure. Because we live this, and it's our local experience. And this also facilitates that whenever we want to address something complicated, the local knowledge can say, I will sample here because I know that here there is something strange. And this happens when you are living there and you have this local knowledge. That's why also it's so important to address this locally. The local knowledge is essential sometimes to ensure this completeness at the end. I don't know if I answered your question.
I think you did. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire and Jaume. Do we have any last questions before we move on to the next steps? Andrea, yes.
Good morning. You hear me?
Hi. Yeah.
Hi. So, Jaume, I love so much your presentation, especially in the first slide where you show us the different steps between the data information knowledge zone. And you said that if there is an error in these steps, probably a cascade effect would appear. So for me, this point is very crucial and important, because the main functioning of citizen science is probably this. So to monitoring, to new and considering on the biodiversity structure is important to avoid some problems in the ecosystems, in some environments. So this is only an observation of your presentation, and that's all. So for me, citizen science is very important for this point, to avoid some human problems, human mistakes, for example, that we see in the last decades with climatic change, increasing of pollution, invasive species, alien species. So by monitoring and providing the new software instruments is important to consider all these points.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, it's true. But we have to keep in mind also that in citizen science, like in other type of science, there could be some potential bias. I have no time to address this, but for example, now, as I mentioned, for example, in Catalonia, we have these 600 kilometers, but we have now at present much more active people in the north than in the south, because there are some population differences, but also because, as I always say, there is a kind of ambassadors, people really motivated that, sometimes also attract many people. And here in the north, we have like 2 or 3 people that are really active. And, we have a WhatsApp group, and every weekend they say, hey guys, we're going to that beach. Who wants to come? Oh yeah. And because they know they have a very high expertise, people love to snorkel or dive with them, because they can teach many things, and many eyes, wow, we've seen this and that. And this is a kind of, if you want, later on a bias, in a sense that if I want to evaluate the biodiversity all over the coast, I have some differences in the north, in the south, that maybe are not because the north are richer than the south. It's basically because now we have more activity in the north and the south. And this creates the needs to correct this, to identify it better, well. But I think this is part of the academics. We know that, and that's why I mentioned in my previous project, I talk about unstructured or structured citizen science. This is the clear case that happens when there is unstructured citizen science. In some cases, there are very active people. In other cases, are not so active people. And we need to balance this. And this requires new mathematics in some cases. It's the same happen. And that's why also I put the example of Newton. Newton creates new mathematics to address the problem, to understand the movement of the planets. And probably we need, because of the big data, and probably this, I would say, data-driven methods based on artificial intelligence, maybe play a strong component or a strong element in the future to understand when we address this unstructured citizen science. I have to tell you that it's very difficult to reach the completeness. I mean, 600 kilometers trying to convince people following the same protocols. As soon you start, stretching or reducing, no, you have to go every week at that time. And so people say, oh, too complicated. Sorry, I have no time. But if you allow people to do it on their own, and this creates this kind of potential completeness. But this creates then the complexity of analyzing this data, knowing that the people are acting in a different way. And obviously, people is heterogeneous, communities are different, and they behave a little bit in a different way. And we need to address this, knowing that this problem, if you want, or challenge rather than problem. It's a challenge.
Yeah, this point is crucial for standardizing the data collection and
to understand this. But the same happened, if I give you an example, I think similar things happen in the past with remote sensing. During the 60s, when people say, okay, let's try to measure, I don't know, sea surface temperature from satellites or chlorophyll from satellites. Many of those academics at that time, they said, oh, come on, you're crazy. Are you telling me that you will take a picture thousands of kilometers on top of the sea, and you don't know anything about what is happening with the atmosphere? You don't know what is happening. It's crazy. You will not get anything. It's a a waste of time. But then there will be all this theory about how the light interacts with the atmosphere, and now I don't know if you're familiar with remote sensing, but it's very classical to have atmospheric corrections. You take out the atmosphere and then you analyze what is happening. Similar thing may happen in citizen science. We need to correct what is this layer of social interactions, or I don't know how to call it. But to understand this, it's part of our science, if you want, as addressing citizen science, and correct this or normalize this activity, and then we can compare the results from different areas, knowing that there are different communities involved in data collection. It's part, if you want, of this data quality assessment.
Thank you, Jaume. We are 10 minutes over time, so in case anybody wants to leave, you have the permission to leave, and all of this will be shared with you. I just want to make a comment. This data accuracy also reminded me, because I used to be a stem cell scientist, and we are forced to work within the limitations of funding, of time crunch, and of course, if you have your cell sample on ice versus on not on ice, the dye, it incorporates in itself, it changes readings, and this kind of also with data integrity, because it is so easy to manipulate data just by a fraction of seconds or minutes, depending on what you're working on. And another thing, like also in health sciences, I remember a couple of years ago, I was getting tested for TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, from 3 different laboratories, 3 different results, having either prescribing me medication for thyroid or not. And yes, most of us know that thyroid is a very sensitive hormone. It fluctuates with the time of day. It is taken the amount of sleep you've had the previous day, if you're under stress or not. It is so volatile in that sense. However, in clinics and medicine, we don't care so much about so many variables that could determine should we get medicated or not. And just based on one sample, we are prescribed medicines or not. And take this to mental health, take this to so many different health scenarios. It is concerning. And it's frustrating that the onus lies on the patient to be more aware, to take care of their health and how to treat their data. But I just wonder if you have any comments on this, because we're all part of this system and there's only so much we as individuals can change. Also, it takes time if you
Yeah.
want to be very accurate, and it takes money, and there's a lack of resources all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It's a kind of challenge. As you can see, there is implicit in the mentions or the ways that I explained here. There is implicit a bottom-up action. Local people plays a very important role. It's true that also these local people can learn through the process. The community, when they start monitoring and so on, because they interact with the academics, with people that know better things on that, they learn also at the time. It's also possible to think about microfunding, because imagine that there is one local people, this happens. Some of them are so motivated that they try to find funding by themselves, and they do not require such a huge funding that we need, for example, to set up the citizen observatories. If the citizen observatories are already there, maybe, with the local, I don't know, bank or a local people, okay, they got a little bit of money and they could keep that. And I think this idea of interacting local people and learning and improving, it's part of the system that we can first ensure long-term sustainability, and also interaction between locals, increasing or improving many things. And also, in some cases, these interactions say, oh, did you find this? We never found that. Oh, and this type create, knowledge transfer among local communities, which is also very important. It depends a lot on the scenario and so on, but I think for me, this bottom-up approach is what is more promising in the context of citizen science, and also going not only on science, but also in actions or activities, or that it's very important to empower them to create, knowledge, but also allow them later on to take their own decisions at local level, but also with the strength that being supported by a huge meta community, if you want.
Thank you, Jaume. Anupoma.
You touched upon a very critical piece of information. Just think about how drugs are tested in clinical trials. There are certain population most of the companies do not test on because it's just too expensive and takes too long time. For example, it used to be women, totally avoided, children, still avoided. And when you think about special populations like who do not fall into male or female genders, or who have a different type of anatomy, these populations, lactating women, these populations are never tested. But after the drug is approved and in the market, it is prescribed to all kind of population. So this is where citizen science become very, very important. The post-marketing pharmacovigilance, what you observe when you are using this kind of drugs or any kind of intervention, to say, what you observe, it is vital data, and it is always very important to communicate with all the relevant stakeholders what you are observing. Don't think that I'm not a scientist, therefore what I am watching or observing is not scientific data. Don't think like that. Your every observation is data, and if it is collected in a systematic way, it is science. So communicate.
Thank you, Anupama. One last question from Jessica.
Yes, if there's time. Thank you so much for the presentations. I'm quite new to this, so it's really, really enlightening to hear. I come more from the community organization and actually open source hardware realms, and so I was really curious what the process was to create the data collection tool with Arduino. Like if there was any particular connection to the open source hardware community in the area, and if that helped, and if it was also maybe a collaborative participatory process to develop the technology in order to make it possible.
Yeah, at the time we did, we were not, connected with open hardware community. It was a funded project, so I had the opportunity, to hire a very good engineer. So the engineer was the one paid for that, but obviously everything is open hardware and open software. And you touch a very important thing, and that's why I think it's very important maybe to differentiate between different types of community with different type of interest. So are these ideas, there are this community of makers that they want to exchange between them, ideas, improvements. We have changed. In fact, well, Carlos is here. Carlos is developing now the second version. We changed a little bit the hardware, but this is a very important thing that many people love this type of discussion. But why are you using this, technology and not this, that? Or have you tried this or things like that? And I think this community needs also to create their own and grow as a kind of parallel. So because in many cases people think about citizen science in terms of the observation, no, on participating on collecting the data. But what about creating this kind of their own technology? And sometimes the people that creates the technology are a little bit different than the people that use it. And in other cases, it's interesting to have this kind of dialogues between them in this type of co-creation, because the users also can provide some useful information saying, guys, this is nice, but it's very difficult to use, very complicated. The software needs to be improved and so on. But yeah, now I think one of the things we have discussed a lot, and that we should create like a kind of ecosystems and people, sharing ideas as observers because they feel better as a kind of the observing community, other the analyzing community, another the making community. And this type of open hardware communities are it's also a framework very nice to deal with, and we try to promote. So you are more than welcome, Jessica, if you want to promote this, because we've been working with several now, but yeah, let's do it.
Thank you so much.
That's amazing. It'll be grand if we get a collaboration out of this webinar. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jaume. Just very quickly wrapping up to our next. So in 2026, this was our second talk. We already have a date for the next session, which will be the 3rd of July, and the talk will be very interesting talk as well on science communication and citizen science project. And as we've shared earlier, this ECS, which is European Citizen Science Project, is coming to its end in July. We are currently discussing how to keep this network alive because it has been such a wealth of information and network of researchers interested in citizen science. We don't want to let it go. So we're currently discussing, and as soon as we have more information, we will be sharing it with you. We'll also share the recording of today's session and the summary later. As most of you are aware, we do have a mailing list. If you are part of the NR4CS network, which was a requirement to join this session, you're already part of the mailing list. You're welcome to connect with other people by responding to that mailing list. If you have any confusion around it, feel free to write it to me and I can share the email address with you. This is a QR code for the resources that are openly shared and published on Zenodo. We also on the MCA YouTube channel, if you just type in NR4CS, you have access to all the videos of all the talks we've had since 2024, 2025, and 2026. And we'll be adding on other talks as well as open resources. And I think that is it from me. Claire had to leave already, but thank you everybody again for joining and making this session so interesting and so invigorating. And this is the second time we've had Jaume with us. And Jaume, I can't tell you how inspiring your talks are and how informative and knowledgeable They are. And thank you so much for coming again to speak at our event. And thank you also to Anupoma for sharing a very sensitive but very urgent and timely topic of rare diseases and patient involvement with us. So with that, I would
Thank
like
you
to
for
close.
inviting me. Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks so much.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Everyone.
Have a good weekend. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, thank you.